I am the program's exhibition manager. My name is Taryn Jones at the Branch Museum. We have another wonderful book talk tonight. Today we have Thomas Woltz, who will be discussing Nelson Byrd Woltz and the Garden Park Community Farm. This is a beautiful, beautiful book that really dives into the contemporary visions for sustainable design. Thomas Woltz explores many variety of landscapes, parks, environmental conditions to explore ways to conserve agricultural practices and implement sustainable practices into everyday landscape for everyone. A little bit about Thomas Woltz. He is the owner of Nelson Byrd Woltz Landscape Architects. Over the past 2 decades of practice, he has drawn inspiration connections between people and the natural world. He's educated at the University of Virginia and holds master's degrees in landscape architecture and architecture. He holds an honorary doctorate of science degree from the State University of New York in environmental science and forestry from Syracuse University. Before we kind of jump into the content of tonight, I definitely want to let you know that we will be recording this event. And if you have any further questions or comments, please use the chat box to drop them there. We'll be answering them hopefully at the end, but definitely periodically throughout if there are any pressing concerns. Once again, we have Nelson Byrd Woltz discussing Garden Park and Community Farm. I would love to jump into it. We're going to be discussing a few of the items from the book today, not the entire thing, and we'll definitely hope to purchase the book with that interest and explore more of the work that they're doing. But without further ado, I'd love to pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Taryn. It's been a pleasure getting to know you over the course of this, and it's an honor to get to speak at the Branch Museum of Architecture and Design. We need more institutions like that in the world to spread the good word of the power of design in our daily lives. So I'm going to jump in by sharing my screen. And I will speak to the slides on the screen. And again, if there are questions, people are welcome to put those questions into the chat box. I am just thrilled to be here and have a chance to discuss this book with you. I want to begin by acknowledging the role of Warren Byrd, who was my former business partner. He was my teacher and was the founder of Nelson Byrd Woltz with his wife, Susan Nelson. They have retired, and now I'm the sole owner and principal of the firm. The work you will see today spans the range of the practice from earliest days. Around 24 years ago is when we started building a lot of projects. And it's been an incredible journey, and I'm excited to share that with you today. This is the cover of the book, and it bears explanation. You're seeing Warren Byrd, my co-author there. It bears explanation because it's an odd title. A lot of what we are trying to do in the world right now is expand the reach and definition of landscape architecture. I feel passionately that landscape architects have a unique toolkit, a unique set of tools that can be transformative, facing many of the giant issues that we confront today: climate extremes, food scarcity, loss of biodiversity, social inequities and injustices as they relate to land. Landscape architects tend to think in systems, they think in multiple layers at once, and they strive to use design as a way to reveal the quiet histories, sometimes hidden histories of a site. So I'm going to walk you through the 4 chapters of the book that are gardens, parks, communities, and by that we mean planning, often university or campus planning, and then farms, which is an unusual part of our practice, where we work in the preservation of sustainable agriculture. So we'll see, just to explain the format, we'll see a project of each of the chapters from this book. And then, because it takes a long time to build a landscape, you don't really want to photograph it for the first year or two. You then take the pictures, and then you work, in this case, with Princeton Architectural Press to pull the book together. And so by the time the book is finished, you have new projects that are on the board. So I thought I would pair a project from the book with a new project that has either just been built, some of them unseen until tonight. So I do also want to acknowledge our editor, Stephen Orr, who was extraordinary, editing the volume, and Elizabeth Meyer, a professor at the University of Virginia, who wrote essays for each of the chapters. So let's go. We'll start with the spread of our firm. We are working in 25 states and 3 Canadian territories, and we have also worked in 12 countries around the world. Our process is one of research-based, designed to understand the ecology and the culture that shapes a place, and then using our tools as designers to reveal those stories for a resilient future. It's a simple method, and it has applied itself in many different ways in many different countries. So we'll start with chapter 1, gardens. The first garden might be the project that you would most expect to see in a book about landscapes. It is a private residence. This is perhaps one of the last private residences we did, maybe 10 years ago. It's called Iron Mountain House because it's set into a quarry that was blasted in the 18th century to get iron ore for the Revolutionary War against England. One side is excavated into the raw parent rock, and the other side are walls built of that rock that retain the site to make a plateau for this house that was designed by a brother for his sister. So we were involved in designing the landscape context. Here is the house as it sits on this plateau. I think the expectation early on was that we would cover all of that rock. Our team got so excited about exposing it and telling this story of this rock merging with the walls that we use to stitch the site together. So you're seeing board form concrete walls coming out of this parent rock, and the house actually built into the walls of raw rock. Because iron had been extracted from the site, we're always looking for clues from the site to tell us what the materials of the project should be. Here we used Corten steel, that is, an iron product against these rocks that actually have stains like the Corten coming out of the stone. In this case, we made a vegetable garden in the shape of an amphitheater, a basin for washing vegetables built into the wall. And you can see how it tooths into this stone. Then we used native prairie plants, warm season grasses to make a kind of perennial and grasses garden that leads you out to a stunning view off the prow across the 300 acres that are part of an active farm. So restoring this entire field to prairie was a big part of this project. So taking an abandoned post-industrial site, an excavation for a quarry, and making it a center of biodiversity, in particular supporting pollinator habitat. The next garden I'll show you is one that we just finished, and this is the courtyard of the Peabody Essex Museum. The Peabody Essex Museum is the oldest continually running museum in the United States, and it's a combination of the Essex Museum of Natural History and the East Indian Marine Society. They came together, the Marine Society was founded in 1799, but they came together in the 1800s to make what's now known as the Peabody Essex Museum. Millions of accessioned items, but the roots of the museum were really about nature, ecology, and culture. For the East India Marine Society, you had to have crossed Cape Horn or Cape Hope to be a member of the society. And what happened was members would bring artifacts back from around the world. How do you capture that in a space that's 28 feet by 60? It's one of the tiniest projects we've built, but it's packed with ideas. So I wanted to walk you through a couple of those. Because navigation and the sea was at the heart of this museum, we looked at monitoring and mapping of currents in the oceans. We grabbed that, captured it, carved it in stone, and water runs over this fountain. So you're seeing the facade of the building that was built by Ennead Architects, and we were their partner in doing all of the landscape. So this giant block of stone is inserted in the wall, and water sheets down over it, recalling the movement of the seas. You're then seeing this line that invites you to explore into the next garden room. That line actually moves into the museum through the galleries and back out again. We looked at the fact that this was a museum of natural history, this beautiful photograph of a skeleton. also the way water works in this region. This is in Salem, Massachusetts, and the coastal ecology has this amazing curvature. Much of the collection is East Asian. So we looked at this wonderful fountain in the Forbidden City that is called a poetry rill, where you would write a poem, put it in a teacup, and float it down the rill, and your friend or lover or someone across the way would then take out the message and read it. A very slow way to have a dialogue. But even the pre-Columbian rock carvings have this similar mark or trace. So we took all of that and compiled it to make this center courtyard fountain that and draws from the idea of the poetry rill of these two fountains coming together in this sinuous shape that reminds us of the snake skeleton and the way the water of coastal Massachusetts runs. So this is the garden looking head on, and you can see the water moving through the rill, a detail of the granite work, all of this beautifully carved stone, and the way this canal snakes through a bed of sedums. The next chapter of the book is parks. So I wanted to talk about a very important park. This project was led by Warren Byrd, who, as I mentioned, retired around 8 years ago from the firm, our founder of the firm, co-founder. And this is an extraordinary project that was a result of a competition done with a much bigger team to commemorate the tragedy of September 11th. Paul Murdoch from Los Angeles was the leading architect, and he invited Warren and NBW to join his efforts to win this competition. The team was selected, and one of the essential ideas around this massive field that was post-coal mine tailings was to have a half-mile diameter circle of red maples, an allée, a double row of red maples, that around the first week of September would go into fall color, so that the landscape itself went into mourning, acknowledging the horrors of September 11th. It all told, I think it's around 3,500 acres of national park now. At the beginning, where you drive into the park, there is a tower that's called the Tower of Voices. You then drive through the fields, and the memorial, if you can see on the screen, is the central circle with 40 radiating forests of native trees, each representing one of the individuals of the 40 people that were on the flight. This is the Tower of Voices, designed in detail by Paul Murdoch, cited by Nelson Byrd Woltz. You visit this tower, in it are long chimes, 40 of them, and one of the characteristics of the site is constant winds. So the winds blow through the Tower of Voices, and their voices ring out across this massive landscape of memory. This is an aerial of the final project. The blue line is the flight path. The plane exploded and came to rest at the number 2 on the screen, which is the sacred ground. Only family members are allowed there. But you see this massive circle around a meadow that had been coal mine tailings. And the warm season grass meadow has been an effective way to clean that soil, stabilize the soil, and make a beautiful landscape for all to visit. This is the wall of names, and you can see the red maples going into fall color behind the wall. This is the vestibule of the museum, designed by Paul Murdoch. Paul and Warren and both firms worked very closely on all aspects of the project. It's an extraordinary team effort and a remarkable landscape of memory marking the tragedies of that day. Here, the circle crosses a wetland, and then here, the last shot is on a winter day. The power of this giant geometry embracing the loss of a nation. More recently, we have just opened last June another park called the Eastern Glades at Memorial Park in Houston, Texas. As you can see in the slide, that dashed line is the site that we are working inside of a much bigger project that we're doing for Memorial Park. This was an area very underutilized, terribly overgrown with invasives and had a large road running through the middle of it. So we proposed to move the road to the edge of the park to create about 110 acres of new landscape right in this eastern corner of Memorial Park. We proposed to excavate a lake that would offset irrigation needs and create a kind of civic green, a living room for all the people of Houston that would have pavilions, a really passive recreation area, pavilions for cooking out, for gatherings. I tell you, this opened during COVID, and the day it opened, there were no celebrations or events because there really couldn't be. They just took down the construction fence and people just started to wander in, marveling that this new kind of jewel had appeared during the pandemic. Of course, it had been conceptualized years before, and we've been under construction for a very long time, but it was exciting to see people explore it. This is an image of it completed. You're seeing the new lake, the boardwalk. There are wetlands throughout the forest, and we created a series of trails. And we're honoring this long axis back to downtown. This was a World War I training camp, one of only 2 left in the United States that was not developed. So acknowledging this axis and the historic entrance as the civic entryway into the park was an important gesture. Here, coming down a little bit, you can see the new lake, the esplanade, the terrace, and the access back into the city. As I said, people just pioneered it and used it in all kinds of passive recreation. Houston is one of the most diverse populations in the United States, as our 3rd or 4th largest city in the US. And it has brought our whole team so much joy to see this working. This park is a remarkable coming together of the Memorial Park Conservancy, the Houston Uptown Development Authority, it's a tax increment reinvestment zone, and the City of Houston's Parks and Recreation. So it's been a terrific coming together of public interests and private interests to make this park happen. English architects worked with us to develop the detailing of the pavilions. Again, it makes me so happy seeing people pioneering the space and using it in creative ways. Here we built a very rich marginal wetland edge, and you can see moving into the forest, you have this ribbon of boardwalk that invites the public to have greater exposure to these different ecosystems. In this boardwalk, the team was inspired by fallen trees that you find in the 1,600 acres of forest. The park is around 1,540 acres. But you see these fallen trees through the forest, and that inspired the form of these crisscross boardwalks, which also yield a kind of lookout at the end of each boardwalk. And here's a child exploring the forest. And this is a thing, no one expected to find in the middle of Houston, this beautiful lake looking to the west with fantastic sunsets. The 3rd chapter of the book, next to last, is community. And this is a chapter that really embraces planning, town planning, and also campus planning. The project that I'm featuring here is the Dell at the University of Virginia. This is another project led entirely by Warren Byrd to create a stormwater management system, water quality improvement system, where a stream had been buried, I think in the 1920s. The stream was buried in a pipe to create actually a small golf course through the campus at the University of Virginia. So the idea was to daylight the stream. We had to dodge tennis courts, soccer field, and then, as you can see in the dashed red area, it was just open flat land. And the bottom, you're seeing Warren's design for daylighting the stream, and then this large basin that could catch sediment and improve water quality before the stream went back on its way. This is an aerial of the project. The sharp right angle is acknowledging the geometry of the lawn that is just nearby. And the other edge is really that sort of Piedmont upland curvature ecosystem emerging from the water. I'll draw your attention to the parking lot and the basketball courts. So there's also a screen of plantings to kind of create this sanctuary for wildlife, for bird life, for people life. in this project. And I'll come back to that, but I wanted you to notice that in the slide. This is the upper basin that is a sediment basin that can be cleaned out every 5 years to protect the water flow from carrying sediments from upstream further downstream. Here's from that basin looking out to the other buildings of the university. And then, again, seeing people delight in the experience of landscape is one of the great thrills that everyone working at Nelson Byrd Woltz feels. This is it in fall color. And again, you can see the lighting and the basketball fields to the left. This winter photograph always catches my breath. So I'm bringing you to this point to mention the Contemplative Sciences Center at the University of Virginia. This is a project that is just about to break ground. And it is a center devoted to wholeness, wellness, the meditative sciences, the contemplative sciences is what it's called. And this is a newly funded center that will be built where the parking lot and basketball courts are. And we were invited to work with Robert Venturi and Associates, Venturi, Rausch, Scott Brown and Associates, to develop a massing for the project. That massing still holds true. And it's one of the only examples where a landscape designed the basic form of the building, in the sense that the curvature of the pond of the dell is what, if you open that up as a mirror image, is the basic form of the building. So the center has a deep courtyard that looks out onto the body of water. So this is a rendering of this project that is about to break ground. So it's very, very exciting for us to have worked on both sides. This is partnered with Adlin Darling Architects out of San Francisco. Here's an image. You can see the dell off to the right, how the contemplative sciences will take advantage of the beauty of this body of water, its biodiversity and health. Personally, it's also been exciting to be the principal in charge on a project adjacent to Warren's project, who was my instructor, my teacher, who gave me so much. So in a way, there's this kind of dialogue that I get to have with a project that he led. The last chapter of the book is called Farm. And this is something personally very dear to me, having grown up in Mount Airy, North Carolina, on a working cattle and tobacco farm. It was my grandfather's farm and my father's farm. And I think as a kid, I just wanted to get to architecture school and do something different. So it's funny that a tremendous part of my professional career has been about the practice of sustaining and protecting and preserving agricultural lands in regenerative practices. So I'll walk you through a very important project for me. This was a friend of mine from college who actually got this farm in New Zealand. It's on the east coast of the North Island, and it's a 3,000 acre sheep and cattle and citrus production farm. It was not in good condition. And we set about using our process of ecology to understand what should be the healthy ecologies and ecosystems of this place, and culture, learning about the Maori traditions of land management, the Maori traditions of agriculture, of settlement patterns. We became very close to the Ngatamunahiri iwi. Iwi is each social group is called an iwi. And they live in Muriwai. So you can see at the top part of the screen, the village or settlement of the Ngatamunahiri. The elders of the Ngatamunahiri really took us in, told us so many stories of the land that opened our eyes to seeing this East Coast New Zealand landscape in a different way. Interestingly, the Maori traditions honor ecology in much deeper ways than Western traditions do. And so I really felt like I had met kindred spirits when I met the elders here, because of our work with stewarding fragile or broken ecosystems. At the very top right corner, you're seeing a brown triangle. That is the peninsula or point. This is all on the Pacific Ocean, where we did preserve to restore the habitat of a very ancient animal, the tuatara, the last descendant of the sphenodonts, the dinosaurs, that is native only to New Zealand. You're also seeing where we rebuilt 75 acres of wetlands and reforested the entire coastal edge with 600,000 native rainforest species. The natural ecosystem of this part of New Zealand is temperate rainforest. So this has been an extraordinary project for conservation, also for culture, preserving many of the traditions and lifeways of the Maori people, and reimagining the agricultural practices here in a more sustainable way. Now I'll show you a few pictures of the farm. This is the 75-acre wetland after it was reconstructed. It had previously, before our clients purchased the land, been drained to the Pacific Ocean, which is a very common practice in New Zealand, to drain wetlands to increase grazing land. Well, that makes terrible grazing land. So it wasn't productive. So we said, let's take it out of grazing, working with Kim Dodson, the estate manager, the general manager of the farm, to create a saltwater marsh and a freshwater marsh to enhance bird diversity. This is what it looks like years later. You can see all the trees growing on the islands. You can see the dam between the saltwater and freshwater marsh, and you can still see the sheep working. These ecological landscapes can work hand in hand with agricultural landscapes, and that is the vision of our conservation agriculture studio. We've now worked on nearly 150,000 acres of agricultural land around the world, and it's been a tremendous honor to work on these projects. Here is the fence we put in for the Tuatara Preserve. So the left side looked just like the right side until we put the fence in and planted about 30,000 trees in that area. The fence protects these very rare and endangered animals from predators. There's the first new gannet colony in New Zealand. Because there are no predators on this peninsula, gannets have colonized the area. There are 2 plastic gannets in this picture, but it's very hard to tell what they are, but they were decoys to draw in other gannet seabirds to nest there. Working very closely with the Ngāti people, the tuataras are actually transported in those tubes from a preserve. This is the first time they're coming back to mainland New Zealand in 100 years. And here they are in their preserve thriving. They're now breeding and increasing in population. It's an extraordinary story for conservation. Who would have thought a landscape architect would be involved in a project like this? It brings me great joy. We also designed the citrus production and this bridge leading across to the southern part of the farm. We actually oriented that on a sacred site to the Maori, this honorific position, so that everyone crossing the bridge is in a position to honor that sacred mountain called Mount Taranaki. Here you're seeing the soils tell us everything. The soils to the left part of the picture were wetland soils, terrible for citrus. The soils to the right were much richer soils. So planting hedges to protect the citrus from frost and using the natural arc of the river as the geometry that governs this part of the farm. You can see river restoration of forest trees right along the water. The part that has crops coming right up to the water is not our project. It's not actually owned by this property owner. It's a neighboring property, but you can see the difference in land management is shocking. So I'll close with a current project. We've just delivered the master plan. This is the only project I'm showing you that isn't built, but it's one I'm very excited about because in a way, Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island, Long Island, is an index of landscapes for the Americas, for the United States. It is an extraordinary place under the same ownership for 360 years. It was built as a provisioning plantation in 1651. And I say it's an index of our relationship to land because it has good and very painful stories of enslaved Africans, indentured Native Americans, indentured Europeans. This plantation grew meat and oak trees to make barrels to send to their sugar production in Barbados. So it was, that's why it's called a provisioning plantation. The family held on to it for 360 years, and it was finally inherited by Bennett Knesne, who at 25 said, this is too important a landscape to be in private hands. This should become a public nonprofit, And it is now an educational farm training people in the art of agriculture and the allied arts for sustaining not only Shelter Island, but really a new vision for agriculture in our world. We were hired, Nelson Byrd Woltz landscape architects, to do a master plan to try to decipher this incredibly complex site. So we worked with the descendants of the Shinnecock Nation. Here in the lower right, you see them invited to build a wiki up in the property right in front of the old manor house. How do we repurpose the barns? On the lower left, other members of the Shinnecock Nation are talking to us about historic land management techniques and methods. The upper left is a drawing session with members of the board and the community coming in to weigh in on this important resource. It's now 235 acres. It was 8,000. It was the entire island of Shelter Island. This is a map of the rich ecological communities. And again, the soils will tell us what to do. So what crops grow in what places, the quality of the forest, the quality of the wetlands, and that led us into our recommendations for the ecological management. This I just wanted to show you as part of our process where you have the landscape mosaic history, we call it, and then what results from that? What's the design initiative? An interpretive landscape loop to tell these stories. The evolving orientation from a sea-facing productive plantation to a land-facing farm. The structure of that historic landscape and how that could be restored and brought back to visibility. Over time, the farm became, I would say, quite divided into a mansion and pleasure gardens, and the farm was kind of held off somewhere else. Well, what if the forests and gardens were all productive? What if it's a new vision for productivity in the landscape? And then equity, community, and sustainability. There's an extraordinarily moving burial ground for the enslaved people of Sylvester Manor. There are so many stories embedded in this landscape. And what's extraordinary is the family kept all the records. There's an amazing archive, much of which is documented by Matt Griswold in her book, The Manor, an excellent read capturing the story of Sylvester Manor. This is the final master plan. You can see some of the things I've just talked about. Restoration of the historic gardens from the 17th century to the 21st century. The barns become an educational center, restoring the wetlands surrounding the central gardens and house, and it's how it confronts the sea. And then the organization and structuring of the educational farm, teaching and training the next generation of holistic farmers. This is zooming in on the house and grounds. We made it almost a timeline from the 17th to 21st century of gardens. These are the renderings showing what the Sylvester Manor could come to look like. The Manor is working on fundraising right now to start to implement some of these initiatives. Another rendering is looking from the Manor, which is how the Sylvesters originally arrived to the property, with the barn complex, and you can see the 21st century production greenhouses in the distance. This is the last image of my presentation of the book talk. This is showing the productive farm in the near corner, and you can see the manor house off in the distance on the wetlands leading out to the Atlantic Ocean. Well, it's Long Island Sound that connects in the distance to the Atlantic Ocean. But I'll draw your attention to one thing. There was a grist mill built in 1810 in the town square. The family rescued the grist mill and brought it to Sylvester Manor, and it's in the lower sort of center of this image. But you're seeing off in the distance very contemporary windmills, because making our own energy, closing the loops of consumption, thinking like an island was very important to this project. And this acknowledgement of the windmill fields of agricultural production and the 21st century windmills in the distance, I think is an extraordinary link in this project, which has really sought to reveal the continuity of our engagement with the earth from the earliest colonial settlement, but deeply acknowledging the long, long history of the Nantucket and the Shinnecock Nation in this landscape. All are welcome at Sylvester Manor, and all stories are now being told in this extraordinary American landscape. So I will end there and happy to take questions if there are any from the group.
Yes, definitely. Add the questions to the Dropbox, or I'm sorry, the chat box. Definitely do. We have about 15 minutes for questions, so we can contact those. But just quickly, thank you, Thomas. This was such a fascinating and intriguing presentation. Every project was just such a beautiful sight, honestly, and particularly the last project, the Sylvester Manor Home. That's such an innovative, something I think it's not really done as much in terms of regenerative design in terms of plantations in the United States and in America. So it's really interesting to see that come forward in this scale. I mean, this rendering is absolutely so phenomenal. And like you said, thinking like an island is kind of one common theme, I think, that you all are kind of implementing into this project and into a lot of the other projects. Particularly, I'm pretty used to the one at UVA and have walked past that for several years now. So it's really interesting to see that also come full circle and be holistic in its approach to design as well.
I'm really excited about, well, this Sylvester Manor project is worthy of an hour of conversation alone, because it is so complex, and I wanted to stay within my 35 minutes, but it is such a rich and interesting landscape because of how many different populations it impacted and affected, and the deep commitment of the current leadership and board to tell true and honest stories in the landscape that for generations have been intentionally hidden. I hope people will go and see this extraordinary place. It's open to the public. You will not forget it, and it's really a jewel in the American landscape. I also want to mention, I have the good fortune of speaking with you tonight, and as I mentioned, Warren was the co-author of the book, but it's essential for anyone listening to understand that that I am the spokesperson for a 50-person staff of incredibly talented designers and creative thinkers who have produced all of this work. I am part of the teams, they are the team. And none of this could happen without such an extraordinary group of practitioners. And I hope that young people interested in the pressing issues of our day of climate and agriculture, food security, equity, diversity, and inclusion issues, loss of biodiversity. I hear a lot of young people saying, I want to do something, I want to be involved in that. And landscape architecture is absolutely a place that you can be impactful in your world. It is not the decoration of the outdoors. It is systems thinking to address the pressing issues of our day.
Thank you for answering that. We do have a few questions popping up. The first one, do clients know when they come to you the type of integrated and systems thinking they are going to get, or do you have to educate them on, I guess, your approach to that system level of thinking?
Well, thank you for that question. Do we have to educate clients once we start in the project about our approach? I think that's what the question was.
Yeah.
I would say that has evolved over the 24 years that I've worked here, where the earliest projects were like, please let us do anything. We just want to build some projects, and having admittedly to explain a lot about warm season grasslands, biodiversity, asking to allow cultural research to be part of our brief, to be part of our contract. And some organizations saying, well, we're not going to pay for that, so we do it anyway, because I don't really know how to design a landscape without looking respectfully at its history, at its voice, at its story. Where did it come from? How did it come to be? Who else has been here? That for me is the most important first step in design, is to listen. And so I say that my answer, it has evolved over time, because now enough people know what we do and how we do it, that they're actually coming to us for that process. They say we want to be great stewards of our landscape, both culturally and ecologically, but we also appreciate the art of design, and we understand design as a problem-solving mode of thinking. And so we're just really fortunate that great people call us and want us to work for them. And so there's very little explaining these days. But yes, once upon a time, it was a lot harder.
Okay, I can definitely understand that growth over time, and that's a good thing.
It's a great thing.
Yeah, another question we have are any lessons learned from partnering with contractors to execute these designs? Many of your firm's projects push the boundaries as new concepts for technical execution, and I would imagine can be challenging for the uninitiated. So I guess once again, any lessons learned from partnering with contractors to execute these designs in any sense, I guess.
Yes, so many lessons learned. We have our process, our methodology, but we are not tending farms all day, every day. We are not building rock walls. We are not doing grading and drainage ourselves, right? So we are absolutely dependent on the high quality contractors that we get to work with. And I feel like every time I'm in the field working with masons, grading contractors, horticulturists, I have so much to learn. So it's one of those kinds of professions that the more you learn, the more you realize how much more you need to learn. And that is one of the exhilarating parts of this. It is a remarkably collaborative profession where, many of the masons we work with, I respect as great artists. They look to us for the concept, we look to them for the details of execution, and that dialogue is an incredibly rich and productive one. So yes, we learn a lot from the contractors that we work with.
And then we also have another question. Could you tell us about about some of your projects done in Europe?
Yes, we've completed, over the past 10 years, we've done a number of projects for His Highness the Aga Khan. He's the spiritual leader of the Ismaili Muslim people, and is one of the planet's great philanthropists as it relates to public health in the third world and education and the preservation of ancient monuments. His Highness has restored Humayun's tomb in Delhi, India, many temples in Africa. He's founded a university in Pakistan. And one of the projects in London at the King's Cross development was the Ismaili Cultural Center. And we had the great honor to design a roof garden on that. It was called the Garden of Light, and it was looking at the role of poetry in describing gardens in the history of Islam. And it's a rooftop courtyard that you can't see out, you can only see the sky. So we drew from ancient poetry and script about the garden, acknowledging that so many of the Ismaili Muslims are in London because they were tortured or risked genocide in other parts of the world where they were not tolerated. And so many people are far from home. And the idea that you could read a poem in your language or your script from far away, and in that moment, you could go home in your mind. So it's really a garden of the imagination and of poetry. The other is the Peggy Guggenheim Sculpture Garden in Venice, Italy. I lived and worked in Italy for 5 years between college and graduate school, and had actually worked a little bit on the Guggenheim Garden when I was practicing architecture in Venice. And then years later, Dr. Philip Rylands, the director, invited us to come back and redesign the sculpture garden. I'd love to do more in Europe. So.
Yeah, those are really awesome projects that you have in a variety of fields and locations and regions. That's definitely an important aspect. I guess we are going to wrap up pretty soon. Is there any other things you wanted to kind of add before we head out, leave with the audience? I know you will be also promoting other, projects. So if you want to do that now, that'd be perfectly okay.
Oh, well, no, just, I guess, one thing that is regularly on my mind right now, as I mentioned this a little bit during the book talk, that the potential for landscape architects to be partners in some of the audacious issues that we're facing is quite high. And I think this way of thinking that balances the needs of people, the human experience in nature, in the face of these, I will call them crises of food and shelter and justice and fairness in our world, as we face extremes of climate and issues surrounding food. These are all things that our tools could be used for. I think publicly or politically, the world turns to engineering for solutions. But I think we're entering an era when the solutions cannot be hard-edged. We can't rebuild 19th century solutions in the 21st century. It didn't work to build walls all the way along the Mississippi River. It's led to untold disasters. And the hard edge attempt of permanently reining in natural systems did not work. It will not work. We have to think in gentler ways, more inclusive ways. And I mean that socially and physically. Rivers need to break out of their bounds and then recede back into their channel. We need to leave them space. We need to find forest connectivity. We have to stop using pesticides and herbicides in the suburban landscape. It is absolutely destroying the biodiversity of our world. So there is a lot to be done, not to end on a grim note, but I hope rather an inspiring note, because there are solutions out there. And I think the results, when you imagine a thriving, living river as a large, undulating landscape that has chaos and order mixed together, that we make richer places for people to enjoy, and we have a more authentic connection to nature.
Yeah, definitely. We do have one more question that I want to jump in, because I think it's really interesting, and it kind of alludes to kind of what you've just mentioned. Your projects are one of such a scale with site disturbance and transformation. Do you find most often you can reuse or amend existing topsoil? And there is a follow-up question, but I'll let you kind of think through that first one first. Do you find most often you can reuse or amend existing topsoil?
So that depends quite specifically on what site you're looking at. In the case of Karen Craig Nolan Park, a public park in Asheville, North Carolina, it was a automotive dump. So we thought, well, we have toxic soil. We don't want to haul that off to a landfill where it just becomes someone else's problem. So working with soil scientists, we're piling up the polluted soils, capping that soil and making undulations in the park, and then planting warm season grasses onto those islands that will secure the soil, stabilize the soil, but it is capping the poor soils. So in that case, no, yes, we are reusing those soils, but not in the way you might think. The topsoil is polluted there. So capping it, but keeping it on site and not sending it away to be someone else's problem. In the case of a very large construction project that's in Memorial Park, it's the next project right next to the Eastern Glade that I showed. That is a 1,800 foot long construction of tunnels over the highway that got dropped into the park, and a prairie lifted up and over. So in that case, we stockpiled soils from building the lake. The Conservancy has done an incredible job mulching the thousands and thousands of trees that died after 4 years of drought. So they have mulch, they're building the healthy soil to go back into the prairie project that's the prairie over the highway. And they're actually getting soils from a remnant native prairie, it's called the Katy Prairie, north of Houston, bringing those soils back and inoculating the stockpile. So this is taking years. I mean, this has been going on now for 3 years, inoculating the soils with the microbiome, the fungi that are alive in the native prairie, and getting that started in the soils that will, in 2022, be spread onto the land bridge project, seeded with native seed. And we think that's going to really, in our test plots, that's already showing that it will accelerate the success of rebuilding this native prairie in Houston. So that's just two examples, very different examples. It really depends on the soil. I guess I could have answered that with "it depends," but I'd rather tell the story.
No, that was very, very interesting. Thank you. And then to follow up that question, do you at times discover, and I think you kind of mentioned this in the presentation as well, do you at times discover archaeological surprises during construction that can be incorporated into your design and goals? And so I guess, could you expand upon maybe a particular instance where that happened?
Absolutely. I want to just add or reframe the question slightly. If we discover archaeological remains in construction, that's a very bad thing. We want to discover the archaeological remains during our research period, where we're, again, asking questions of the land and trying to learn the land's story. So we bring archaeologists on site for cursory surveys, just like we bring scientists on site for surveys of biodiversity. Archaeologists help us see old road traces, settlement patterns, scatter sites in Australia and Tasmania, working with archaeologists to identify scatter sites of Aboriginal settlements. In New Zealand, we've worked with Maori archaeologists to understand kumara pits and pa sites, which are sites of habitation and defensive constructions for war. In Memorial Park, again, part of really uncovering the history of the World War I training camp was working with a local archaeologist who told us the stories of where ruins of the old latrine buildings and shower buildings as part of the soldiers' support, because the town, the 30,000 soldiers were housed in canvas. You know, it was an ephemeral city, a massive city. The only things permanent were these shower buildings and latrine buildings. So building on that, we realized that was where we should create a memorial grove to the dead soldiers. So that archaeological discovery in the planning and design phase led to a whole unique piece of the park that is about to go into design today. I really feel so strongly that any major landscape project needs to begin with an archaeological survey. And now the technologies are extraordinary. Ground penetrating radar and LiDAR surveys reveal tiny traces of like patterns of plowing, old road beds, settlement sites. You can see so much with LiDAR surveys. They're absolutely extraordinary and non-invasive. So I think it's extremely important when we care to steward our culture, our collective cultural history, to work with your archaeologist right from the very start. It's an incredibly important part of learning the land.
Thank you for answering that question. So that's going to be the end of this beautiful presentation for tonight. I want to thank you again, Thomas, for joining us at the branch. And thank you, everyone who joined us from wherever you are in